In this topic, we will be introducing the digestive system, talking about where food and liquids first enter the body, how they transport down into the stomach, the rest of the digestive tract, and the different things that happen in each stage along the way. Before we get into that, though, here's a few kind of trivia questions to consider. And before I show you the answer, go ahead and take a second to think about what you think it is, true or false for each of these. So, true or false, you cannot digest food if you are turned upside down. What do you think? The answer is false. We'll talk about this process of muscle contractions that's very coordinated called peristalsis. And peristalsis, kind of like squeezing out a tube of toothpaste, is going to move that food towards the stomach, even if you're lying upside down or flat on your back or things like that. The next one, true or false? Most of your food is digested in your stomach. That's actually false. It's a common misconception. Most chemical digestion actually happens inside of your small intestines. We'll talk about what the stomach does and how you do have some digestion, especially protein digestion happening there, but most of it happens in the small intestines. And the last opening trivia question here, true or false? The salivary glands in the mouth produce approximately 1 to 1.5 liters of saliva daily. So think about if you go to the grocery store and you see those big 2-liter bottles of soda, half of that to 3/4 of that of saliva a day. What do you think? True or false? That's true. It's a lot of saliva, an amazing amount. Luckily, our small intestine absorbs most of that fluid back in. Otherwise, we would get dehydrated much more quickly. And we'll talk about that role of the small intestines along with others in a little bit. Before we get into the specific organs, though, let's talk about the general stages here, or steps of food processing. From when food first comes in, we call that ingestion, or simply eating the food. Then that food needs to be digested. We'll talk about two different types of digestion that are going on, in some cases simultaneously, mechanical digestion versus chemical digestion. After the food has been digested or broken down into smaller pieces, now those nutrients need to be absorbed. And so the next step is going to be absorbing those nutrients. Before we get into that, though, why do you chew your food before swallowing it? I mean, snakes don't chew their food, they swallow it whole. Well, the reason we chew is because that's a part of our digestive process. Chewing is actually mechanical digestion, breaking food into smaller pieces and mashing it up before it travels down into the stomach. So absorption of nutrients, this mainly happens inside of our small intestine, the same location where most of the digestion happens. And then lastly, there are certain things that pass through our system that we're not able to digest, like fiber, which we'll talk about later, or waste products that we want to get out of the body that can go out through our feces, poop, or through our urine. And so these are the 4 processing stages in order. Again, ingestion, digestion, absorption, and elimination. I wish it was in order for like idea. You see here we've got I-D, but it's not idea, it's A-E. So if you're having trouble, think of some kind of an acronym to go in that order, like Ida eats. I don't know. That's not a very good one, but you can think of something if it's something that would help with you remembering those steps. So after the food gets inside, we said digestion happens, and there's these 2 types. Mechanical is physically breaking it down into smaller pieces by using force to mash the food up or push it and squish it, breaking it down to these smaller pieces or pulverizing it essentially. And then there's chemical digestion. This happens in many different stages. Actually, chemical digestion begins in your mouth with your saliva. Right? Your saliva has enzymes that start to break down things like starch into smaller molecules. And then in your stomach, you have enzymes that are going to start to break down proteins. And so chemical digestion is using those enzymes to break things down, but also, especially in the stomach, acid to help break food into smaller bits. Down here we can see an example of an enzyme in the stomach called pepsin. You may have heard of Pepto-Bismol. Pepsin is referring to this enzyme in the stomach, and it operates at high acidity, which is important because the stomach is a very, very acidic environment, almost as acidic as battery acid in a car. And that enzyme then helps to break down this larger molecule. We'll introduce this term in a future topic, polymer, into a smaller molecule, which we call then a monomer. Oops. So as mentioned, absorbing happens mainly in the small intestine. The small intestine has these crazy finger-like projections that create a lot of folds in there. And actually on these, there are even more folds. And those have even more folds going off of them. So it has this massive surface area, which allows for rapid absorption of nutrients. And then elimination. So we'll talk about the large intestine, basically solidifying our waste products and transmitting that down to our rectum, that then comes out the anus, and hopefully in the toilet. Okay, so the human digestive system is also referred to as this continuous tract, or at least part of it is a continuous tract. I'm going to figure this pen out someday. Yeah. And that is called the gastrointestinal tract. Gastro refers to stomach, intestinal, of course, refers to intestines. And there are these different stages here. So we've got the mouth actually up here, not labeled, but starting out with the mouth. Moving back through the back of the throat, called the pharynx, down into the esophagus, that gets pushed down into the stomach, leaves the stomach, goes into the small intestine. These other glands or organs that add different things to help break food down. Not listed here is the gallbladder. And then that food continues through the small intestine, digestion finishes up, most of the nutrients are absorbed. Makes its way into the large intestine where a few other things are absorbed, the waste is solidified, then comes out the rectum and then out the anus. And you can use your phone and put it on the camera function, hold it up to this spot over here and scan it. That will bring you to a link for a video to go ahead and review this further if you'd like. It's a really good one, and so I'd encourage you to take a look at that after you finish going through this topic. So as mentioned, the gastrointestinal tract begins at your mouth where ingestion occurs. The mouth is also referred to as the oral cavity. As I briefly mentioned before, after food gets into your mouth, it gets pushed back by your tongue into this round structure that forms of the food. It's called a bolus. You won't need to know that for this class, but if you go into anatomy, they will use that term, B-O-L-U-S. And that round bolus then goes into the pharynx, which is another name for the throat. Back there, we'll talk about this in lab when we do our pig dissection. And from there, that needs to go down the right tube. So we've got two tubes, one down here that transports air, and another one that transports food. So this little flap right here is called the epiglottis. That is going to push and close off the entrance to the air passageway so that food has no choice but to go down the esophagus. So it protects the trachea where air is supposed to go through, and then food and liquids go down the esophagus instead. On occasion, it goes down the wrong pipe, triggering this cough reflex to try to get it back up out of the air passageway. So the stomach, of course, is the next stop. So food moves from the esophagus. You can see here in this GIF that it's being pushed down progressively towards the stomach through this process called peristalsis. And the stomach has a lot of folds inside of it, but it's not for absorbing nutrients. Instead, it's for allowing it to stretch massively, kind of like a wrinkled up balloon that you can blow into it and it'll stretch up further and further and further. And in the stomach, I'd mentioned that there's this very, very strong acid, and that's present or secreted into what's called gastric juice. Gastric juice contains this strong acid that's secreted by the cells of the stomach, at least some of the cells, and also enzymes. I mentioned pepsin before to help break down proteins. Continuing on to the small intestine, that's where most chemical digestion occurs and also most absorption.